I think a lot of people don't know how much time has to go into it and how much work goes into it. Because I mean, on Instagram, it does kind of look like I'm always on vacation.
And 14 years in, and you're 27 now, so you started at 13.
Yeah, it's just like a little hobby in the beginning. Am I just too complacent and too comfortable and maybe asking for too much?
So when friends, family, people you meet, someone asks, "What do you do?" What do you answer?
I mean, even though this industry has been around for so many years, the answer kind of changes every time,
Yeah,
right? It's like it's either between I own a media company, which is at essence what it is,
yeah,
and I make YouTube videos for a living.
yeah.
So, yeah, I think I mean, usually when people ask, I still found like even a few weeks ago, I was like, I don't really know how to explain this of like what I do. Like, yeah, I make YouTube videos, but that sort of doesn't sound like a job to some people,
Right.
and then to others, it's like, yeah, it's a media company, and we make content for some of the biggest tech brands and travel brands in the world, and so. I mean, even 14 years in, it's still trying to come up with a proper elevator pitch answer to the question.
Yeah. And 14 years in, and you're 27 now, so you started at 13. Yeah,
Yeah, just like
that's
a little hobby in the beginning,
that's
filming with
amazing.
an iPod and see where it goes. And I think even nowadays, it's see where it goes.
Yeah. So I'm really curious why you do what you do.
Yeah, so I think like similar to a lot of people who create content for a living, it all stems from an element of just curiosity. Growing up, I wasn't somebody who was really interested in tech, and so my way of entering the industry was when I was looking to buy my first tech product. Naturally, I went to YouTube, and that was like the most interactive way to see a product being unboxed, being used, being demonstrated, and that was the iPod Touch. And so I would watch like videos of iPods being unboxed while I was saving up for it, and it was a very authentic experience of portraying what it was like to unbox a new tech product in the most raw form possible. And so after watching hundreds of videos and watching the same ones over and over again while I was waiting for my moment to unbox the iPod, I was sort of like, I've learned so much about this product through the internet and through YouTube that it made sense to maybe look into making my own videos, because at the same time I was seeing an opportunity where a lot of people were getting a bunch of free products, and I wanted a bunch of accessories, but after buying the iPod, I couldn't afford any accessories. And so it started from the iPod. It led on to like different tech products, smartphones, and then many years later, it led into real estate, where I was buying properties and receiving a bunch of free products and collaborations with brands to be able to build my dream home multiple times again. So it all came from curiosity, and with that, it was also the right timing. It was 2010. The industry was growing, and companies were starting to do influencer partnerships, and I just happened to be growing my channel at the exact same time where brands were searching for people to work with.
Yeah. Wow. So it starts from curiosity of products themselves, and then
hmm
you got into kind of sharing that curiosity with others. I saw one of your earlier videos of the Samsung versus Apple phone.
Yeah,
That still has a lot of views.
that's probably still the most viewed video to date. I think at about 3.5 million views, and that was just a video made in high school. Went home, made the videos, uploaded it probably at school, and published it at the school library. And each recess, I would just be going to the computer, logging in and refreshing the video and seeing where it was at. And the curiosity was not only within the products, but also in the industry of like, what is this YouTube thing? How do views work? The 5-star rating system, thumbs up, thumbs down, comment section, all that kind of stuff. And so it was it was kind of a learning experience as someone who didn't really have a strict passion or a content or a career path at the time. It ended up just being like an accidental career path.
Yeah, and I noticed even in that video, like very different than today, we didn't see your face, right? It was
Yeah.
voiceover and just showing the products. And I'm kind of curious if that relates, and starting at the age of 13 in this industry, how you see age play into the whole thing, right? As someone who's gone
hmm
through from 13 to now 27, has that been challenge, benefit, advantage? How do you see it?
I think the biggest advantage is starting early, and content has changed so much that as someone who's 27 now, I kind of said like if I started today, I don't know how I would grow my channel, my YouTube channel, my TikTok, and whatever it is, because it's a very different understanding of the industry. I feel like TikTok is one that is very new to me, and short form content is something that I just don't really understand how to operate on. And so starting at the age of 13, learning long form content, learning how to talk in front of the camera as someone who is like talkative but shy, I feel like is a very similar origin story that a lot of the top content creators are very shy people who like typically kept to themselves, stayed at home, but had a lot to share to the world. And so the internet was like an outlet for that. And so, yeah, starting out at that age, it was kind of a safe space to talk about whatever I wanted to talk about, like a passionate topic, and find like a niche on the internet of
Mhm.
people who are also interested in that. And from there, you can like talk to them about like your favorite tech products, content creation. There was a whole bunch of like group chats and also creators like strategizing how to navigate the industry. So yeah, I think age was the biggest advantage, and I encourage people nowadays to even start as young as possible because for a lot of people at that age, you have a safety net. You can fail, you can do whatever you want, and not have any consequences from time standpoint and from taking risks of spending your time creating content. And so, I think starting earlier allows you to at least strengthen your opportunity at doing it full time. Whereas when you're a little bit older and you might have a job and you might have responsibilities, you kind of have to weigh your risks a little bit more of how you want to allocate your time and whether you want to dive in head on.
Right. And so going back then, I mean, I don't know a lot of 13 or 15-year-olds who are maybe willing to put in 5 years of, limited to no results,
Hmm.
right? Or limited results. Like, how did the psychology of that as sort of the persistence of cranking out contents, videos every week without, like, now you've got amazing results, right? Like, I think today you're at closing in on 150 million views just on YouTube. You've got all the other channels as well, 850 subs, 1,300 videos. Obviously now there's probably this gravity or pull for you to keep going, and
Hmm.
obviously revenue, which is great.
Yeah.
But in those early years, what keeps you going?
I think always finding what motivates you at any given time in life. And that's going to change many different times throughout the 14-year career, but a lot of it is still very similar. And it's no secret that money is a big factor in the influencer industry nowadays. But back then, as I sort of alluded to, I didn't really know what I wanted to do as a career
Mhm.
because I wasn't really good at school and I
Mhm.
wasn't motivated by it. And I didn't really know how to motivate myself into doing that. But I also was very interested in tech,
Mhm.
and you need money to buy tech. And so in the beginning, it was just finding little like dopamine hits. And part of that was like getting your first 1,000 views, getting 100 subscribers. And that addiction makes you want to continue to create videos. But at the same time, I was emailing 100 companies a week. And if a couple of them would send me a free product, just waiting for that thing to arrive in the mail was really exciting to me. And then eventually, I found that the only way to make money was not through AdSense because the
Mhm.
views were so low. It was to sell the products. And so that'd be $10 here, $20 there. And in my mind, to buy an iPod, it's $200. I got to do that 10 times. And so I constantly was like very interested by and like kind of gratified by the element of transaction. And
Mhm.
so every time I sold something, it'd be really satisfying. And I just wanted that feeling again. But even before I did YouTube, the way I saved up for my iPod was selling stuff on Craigslist
Huh.
for my parents. And I would get like a 10% commission. And that like transactional interaction was really fun to me. And I found that with YouTube, there's that element with talking to brands, reaching out to them, seeing if they would send you your product and trying to convince them to send a product to a 13-year-old kid,
Yeah.
as well as selling their products afterwards, but then reinvesting all of that money back into creating better videos to hopefully reach a higher audience. And so early on, that was what kind of motivated me. And I think finding those elements, whatever it is for anyone out there, is really important.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when I look at you, and I'm sure when a lot of people look at you, they see someone who must be intensely motivated, right? To get started that early, work so hard to get to a great spot and keep going, shows a lot of motivation. But you're saying, on the school front, not a lot of motivation. So it's funny, so that we sometimes get in this trap of labeling someone as maybe not motivated, right? As opposed to, you're like, hey, I wasn't motivated by this, so I found the passion that motivated me and then went all in on that. I think that's like just a great lesson for young people for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, motivation can come in different ways, and it can be at peak at times, and at times you can also be like, even when you're at like what is supposedly the
Yeah.
peak of your career, you can sort of look back and be like, I've got everything that I've ever wanted out of this industry, but there's still so much more out there. What is like the new element of motivation? And sometimes it goes right back to why you started your endeavor in the first place, and in other times it could take months.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, pulling it forward for a moment to today, like, What's the future look like? What's motivating you now, and what are you striving for the next stage of business?
I think like a lot of it is continuing what we want to do without getting too carried away. And I think what's happened in especially like the last 5 years is we've built the audience and also the connections to the point where there are so many opportunities
Hmm.
to check out products, to work on partnerships in many different realms, including tech, cars, travel, home, lifestyle. And it's almost like in terms of the checklist of brands that we've wanted to work with 10 years ago, essentially every single one and then some has been checked off. And for quite a few years, travel was also the motivation. And so being invited to go check out the headquarters was really cool. But then last year, I had like a 6 month period where I wasn't really interested in traveling because there wasn't that balance. It was 120 flights the year before to
Wow.
like cutting that down to 50 last year. And it just seems like a cycle of like trying to focus on revenue, trying to focus on content, trying to focus on the team. And I think one of the topics of the podcast is like, how do you go from working as someone who's just at your parents' house in the basement filming
Mhm.
videos to building a team
Mhm.
and working with a team, and whether or not that's something that the creator is used to, wants to do, or set out to do. It is a whole learning experience. And so I think like right now and moving on to the future, it's managing the queue of brand deals and partnerships
Mhm.
while also still trying to make the videos that we're supposed to make, we want to make. We know that there's a big benefit to create,
Mhm.
but like we look at it, it's already like in August, and
Yeah.
these were plans that we had in January, and a lot of which we haven't even had time to get around to. And next thing you know, it's like 2 years later.
Yeah. And you mentioned the team. So you're at how many employees now
So at peak
on
we
the team?
had 6 people, and
Yeah.
then right now we have 4 people, and we also have a few remote. And honestly, it was down to it's a business where like you start out by making all of the videos on your own. You
Yeah.
do all of the aspects of like the logistics, you do the communication, you create the videos, you edit them, you do the finance as well. And I found that I'm not someone who likes to manage a big team. And even as capacity continues to increase and the amount of content backlog that we have, which a lot of times can be months and months,
Hmm.
a lot of it still stems down to like I did not have enough time to kind of focus on every single task at hand.
Yeah.
And even from like a bigger picture standpoint, there was a point where we were really focused on like the course as well as the videos, and we also had a retail clothing store, and all of which were doing well. But at the same time, the YouTube was the one that was grabbing the most attention and the time and the
Hmm.
resource, while also generating the largest share of revenue by a relatively large margin,
Hmm.
that you end up contracting back into just focusing on the YouTube videos instead of trying to do every single thing. And then
Yeah.
eventually you get a little bit bored of that. And
Mm.
naturally you want to try a bunch of things again. And so I find that like it wasn't natural transitioning from being an individual content creator to being what is a CEO, which is
Right.
running the company. And so that's something that I'm still learning every day. And I
Mm.
think some creators really, really enjoy that, and some end up essentially losing love for what was content creation because it has become a business and become a team and a
Right.
company that you have to run. And I know like your team's a lot larger, but even at like 4 to 5, I'm like always trying to learn and manage.
Well, you're moving from being the doer, right, to
Hmm.
being the manager, right? And it certainly is a big shift. And honestly, I'm still learning lots of this every day, figuring it out. And it is. I think the struggle of the entrepreneur a lot of the time, because even for me, my passion is still like the doing of things, and so
Hmm.
it's this always this like battle of like, nope, got to like let the team and delegate and hire and lead as opposed to get in and do things. So I can totally see that where you start, especially as a creator, right? Where you're getting in and creating
Hmm.
things that you love and then having to back away from it to bring people in to do it.
And what
Um,
was like the process, I guess, like where like Thinkific started? Was it like a little team at first, and then like what's like your story with I guess the how everything's expanded?
yeah, I mean, it was just me and my brother starting it out, and then slowly grew to a team of, went first hire, and then first hire was a designer,
Hmm.
and went from there to and it really changes. Like I remember at 7 people, you can hear every conversation going around you, and we
Hmm.
were still in office all the
Yeah.
time then, and so I was involved in every conversation. And then you get to kind of 20 and 30, and there's a huge shift of like, okay, I'm not actually involved in every project that's going on. And then you have these other breakpoints at 70, 100, 150. You get to the point where you see someone and you're like, I don't know their name. I'm really embarrassed. At one point we set up an app where you'd show people on the team and the whole company would, you do quiz questions on like, who is it? What do they do? Where do they work? So we could like make sure that when we saw people, we kind of knew everybody. But yeah, there's definitely these stages of just constant learning. I've taken courses, read books, gotten coaching to try and figure out how to do it at every stage.
Yeah, and I guess the art of delegation alone is like its own craft, as
Yeah.
we've heard a lot. I remember you guys partnered up with the Andrew Wilkinson and the Sahil conversation in Vancouver, and I actually met Andrew and Victoria before, and I remember listening to the podcasts on like My First Million and everything. It's like the art of delegation, knowing what to let go of, and I think a lot of creators struggle with that. And it's funny because the first hire, similar to like a designer, was like a videographer and photographer and editor, and I thought that was what I needed, which seems to make sense. It's like you need somebody to help you create your content, but I wasn't ready to let go of that aspect. And so I found the business grew a lot faster when I hired someone who had zero experience in the creative industry, but was more so focused on like the admin side of things and the finance and like a general operations, but would still give creative input from like a neutral perspective. Because I find a lot of times like creators might have opinions where you're like, oh, well, that's just like a different stance. Whereas like a complete outsider is more of a consumer. And so like that art of delegation was, okay, well, I actually needed an ops guy first before hiring the videographers and the creatives.
Well, plus because you were so good at that and you're leaning in there.
I'm still learning over the years, but I do find like having a barrier between creative team and because I served as, I think I would say like I'm 60% business, 30 to 40% creative, but I do have like a very specific way that I like things, as I've been told, and and having like a barrier between the creative team and the CEO, who kind of has to be like the business guy and the creative guy, was an important move. Because otherwise there can be a lot of friction between the design and the business team.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, we call it giving away your Legos to some extent as we start the delegation of like, you have to take the things that you really want to play with and eventually and start giving them away. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned having a finance person. I'm curious, you've got, 6 streams of revenue now?
I think it's been between 6 and 10.
Okay.
I think.
Wow.
But I think 10 was probably about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And then now I think it's 5 or 6.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've kind of like gone from one, you said AdWords, I think initially, then brand deals, gone up to 10, brought it back. How do you think about diversification for creators as they are really scaling? Like, is it something where it's add more lines of business, or do you see it as like lean in on what you're really good at? Because you've gone through the breadth there of, up to 10 revenue streams.
I think like it's important, but it's also not at the same time. And it really comes down to your specific industry. Because I've seen people who are like, well, I make 6 figures from 5 different forms of revenue, and combined it makes 6 figures. And I kind of look at that map and I'm sort of like, if you focus a little bit more on one of those 5 streams, you can make 6 figures off of that one stream. And it's the same with when the business grew from 5 to 6 to 7 figures. At some point, when I first started, the way I made money was actually selling all the products we got for free on eBay. And that alone was able to crack 6 figures, which as a creator with, at the time, like under 50,000 subscribers was actually really, really good, because AdSense would probably make a couple grand a month, which as a high school student was still really good. It was enough to let you buy your new camera and still buy like whatever you really wanted, and even travel a little bit, because I was living at home at the time. But eventually, when say like sponsorship revenue alone hits 7 figures, it is a little bit hard to go back and focus on something that is even 6 figures, like to instead lean in on scaling something that can scale. So even nowadays, like a lot of revenue can come from product sales. It also came from real estate for a bit, where we purchase investment properties, and that's a more passive stream. I think it's not exactly the number of revenue streams, it's more so the type of revenue streams. Like Google AdSense is one where if your views are up, your AdSense money will go up, and in turn that will end up increasing your sponsorship revenue as well. But sponsorship revenue is very much like affiliate revenue, and same with course revenue, where you don't know where the next sale is coming from. You know a ballpark of what it can make a month, but you don't really know where your next deal is. It kind of just works itself out. So I think it's really important to build a robust platform of, okay, like my fixed revenue, which is the passive,
Yeah.
is going to be able to cover, say, like payroll and
Right.
your rent and office and all that kind of stuff. Whereas your additional revenues, where you can actually evaluate how the company is doing overall because it has such a significant chunk of your business. But I think it's also important to drop certain streams that are maybe not as important, because like I think creators realize like they're really spread too thin sometimes when you try to
Right.
do way too many things.
Yeah. And in doing that, do you look at quality of revenue? Like we've looked at, we look at things like, I've talked to creators who look at, gross margins
Hmm.
or revenue per 1,000 views. Or even just, there is also just like the gross revenue, but things like, as you mentioned, like getting paid for ads is probably really low revenue per 1,000
Hmm.
views, as opposed to you're selling products or even potentially courses where you've got the higher revenue per 1,000 views. How do you look at the quality of the revenue that way?
I think like we look at the quality of the revenue as well as opportunity
Hmm.
of the revenue, because like sometimes like sponsorships are having a really good month or a really
Hmm.
good year. Like tech is really influenced by the stock market and
Hmm.
consumer spending, because you can look at those trends, like
Hmm.
how much money are consumers looking to spend. I think even at a micro scale, content creators can also look at the type of content they're creating, and so some creators really focus on tech and they're
Hmm.
really good at it. But what we found is that there's just as much opportunity in lifestyle, in
Hmm.
travel, in cars. And by being present in all of those industries and
Hmm.
tying it back into tech, there's always opportunity. So, say tech is having an off month, we can go and travel
Hmm.
and seek opportunities with some of those
Hmm.
partnerships, and also do car content, which takes a little bit longer, as well as home content, where we're actually
Hmm.
filming our homes that we purchased as investments,
Hmm.
and they end up being luxury rentals for a bit. And so those were kind of always having something to lean in on is really
Yeah.
important. But also when it's a little bit quieter, you could either focus on a new revenue stream, or you could also be like, there's a sector of content that I'm really curious about
Hmm.
that might be worth a try, because we already have all the
Yeah.
resources to do it. So I think
Yeah.
diversifying the content and opportunity stream, but also diversifying the revenue stream is important. And I think there are a lot of people who are great content creators and great business people, but the people who are really good at it are the ones that are creative with how they allocate their time and their resource to
Huh.
seek the opportunities.
That's interesting. I think it's actually the first time I've heard that, of like someone really optimizing and pivoting, like making small pivots month to month based on where the opportunity is, right? I think usually I see people where it sort of heads down on one project the whole way through, but you've got a really interesting approach that of like, I see an opportunity more in travel, tech's down, we're going to go here, almost looking at the economy or consumer behavior and stuff, it sounds like, which that's uh, an interesting way of going about it that I think has a lot of benefit. That's,
Yeah, I think like a lot of
yeah,
travel guys during the pandemic, they started covering more tech.
right.
Whereas tech, we covered a lot of travel before, but then during the pandemic, we were like, well, we've already made desk setup videos,
Yeah.
home videos. Why don't we just lean on that
Mhm.
even more? And created a course during the pandemic as well.
Yeah.
And so yeah, and it's also a good way to just keep things exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, doing something for 14 years
Yeah.
is a long time, but the only way to not make it feel like a long time is to always
Have
explore
some new.
new sectors.
Yeah.
Yeah, because at some point, like going to every single phone launch starts to get really boring, and then you go on a couple car trips, and it's like, wow, like this is really cool. They do it really differently from how like
Right.
tech companies do it, and travel's its own thing.
Yeah.
And then eventually, you're like, you know what? Like I kind of want to go back to like a smartphone event again, and the
Yeah.
Apple campus.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing cycle,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
one that you get quite used to over time.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, watching your video on the Four Seasons jet made me a little bit like, oh, maybe I should go on a vacation soon.
That one was another
Yeah.
like just a pivot. Like it's just
Yeah.
one thing led to another, and one of the representatives happened to be working at the
Mm.
tech company that we did a deal with back when I was in university. And so it was somebody within Four Seasons who was looking to try
Mm.
something new that they had never done before,
Mm.
which is bringing an influencer on a trip with paying guests,
Mhm.
which sounds absolutely crazy to me as well. I was like,
Mhm.
this is like, I don't know if anybody wants to be filmed on this trip. They're
Right.
spending that kind of money on it. But it was both sides looking to try something new, and it
Yeah.
ended up being like kind of one of those collaborations where you're like, that's a once in a lifetime thing. That's
Yeah, it
never
looked
gonna happen.
phenomenal.
I'm never gonna be able to probably go on that again. But like, yeah, it truly was like a cool thing. That's why it's like the main video that's playing on the page.
Yeah. 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 Well, hey, I think it's working because it inspired me to maybe go book with them, so I can see it. I wanted to go back for a moment in time to you making the leap to full time, right? So
Yeah.
I think you were at University of Victoria. You're at about 200,000 subs on YouTube at that point. If that's, tell me if I'm wrong.
I'm trying to remember.
Or yeah, okay.
Honestly,
So,
it
but
might
you're
have
at,
been 400,000.
okay,
Yeah.
but you're been at it for 5 years,
Hmm.
right? You're making. I think I read you're making videos in class and editing and like trying to put a video out a week while working kind of at
Hmm.
night and going to school. Where maybe walk us through in your mind and heart what's going on as you make that leap from I've been at this for 5 years, I'm going to university and I'm gonna go like quit school and go
Hmm.
full time.
Yeah, so I think like during university, or during high school, even it was already like I barely got into university,
Yeah,
and I didn't really have any interest in going, but it was pretty firm that like I was gonna have to go, and so I
that a
stayed in
parent
town.
thing.
Yeah, parent thing,
Okay.
and so like I was there, and it was the same deal. It was sort
Mhm,
of like, you know what, like even though I'm in business school and it's what
mhm,
I am interested in, and the
mhm,
only thing that I possibly could have done in university,
mhm,
I wasn't good at it. Like, I was like, this is not practical. Like, none of
yeah.
the stuff I was really learning here, aside from stuff that is like financial accounting and
Mhm,
like administrative accounting, everything else was sort of like, you know what? Like, I don't really agree with this. Like, I
mhm,
felt like I had a different perspective on business from running a business. And I think, I mean, I did also have a bit of a chip on my shoulder because in high school, I was like, at that point, I was probably making like 25 grand a year off YouTube. And I
mhm,
was like, well, for someone who's going to school 5 days a week and doing it on
mhm,
the weekend, I was like, this is pretty good. And by uni, it was already earning around like what the average citizen would make.
mhm,
I think my parents definitely had questions of like the longevity, but the
mhm,
way I kind of looked at it is like I could go back to university. This opportunity kind of isn't going to wait.
mhm,
And there's like a lot of momentum factors with social media.
mhm,
And the moment kind of came like at the end of the third year. That was a year where the revenue had gone from probably like just scraping six figures to I think like a quarter million that year. Like,
mhm,
and it was something that was unexpected to me, to my parents. And I got a
mhm.
tax bill, a personal
Yeah.
tax bill, because nobody had anticipated me needing to incorporate, just because like my parents didn't really know what I was doing. There's like, he's making internet videos, like nobody
Right.
expects. And so I get this massive tax bill. And at that point, like that tax
They're
bill was
like,
like, I was just like, you know what? Like it doesn't, like, why am I even staying in school if like, you know, I think I should be turning this into a business, traveling the world. And I turned down a bunch of opportunities to travel to different
mhm,
events and make connections with the
mhm,
brands in person before, because of school. And so it was like, you know what, like I feel like I have to leave now. It's the start of the fourth year. I went
yeah.
back for a week and I left, and sure enough, it was about a year and a half
Mhm,
of travel, and the pandemic hit, and the
yeah.
channel in that 1.5 years I think transformed in a way that was exactly what I expected, was within my potential,
Yeah.
and like as good as I could have planned, but I didn't expect it. When I
Mhm.
dropped out, I had like 2 weeks where I just sat on the couch and I didn't know what to do at that time because I'd never done it full time. And
Wow.
so I was like, wait, like now I can actually do like whatever I want, but I'm not. So I
Yeah.
was kind of concerned. And then eventually like, okay, well now like we need to go meet the accountant, incorporate this thing, make my first hire,
Huh.
like figure out what to do with this time and how to structure into a business,
Yeah.
but fundamentally still running the same type of thing as I was doing before. But with that being said, I don't regret going to school. Like it
Yeah.
was like it made me learn like time management.
Mhm.
Um, and I think if I had just gone full time out of high school, it would have been a bit too loose. Like I mean, what we're seeing nowadays is, yeah, it's a very lucrative business for people at a young age, and I'm
Yeah.
seeing kids nowadays who are younger making a lot more
Yeah.
money than I was before, and I find that I see like an issue with them being very loose with their time and
Yeah.
also recklessly spending their money,
Mm.
which can kind of factor into whether or not somebody nowadays making three times the money as I was at like age 20
Mm.
can do it for 14 years.
Right. I think you're right. There is even some of that benefit of you having to go through even the 3 years in school, and interesting that you're like, oh, I wasn't good at business in school, but yet super successful at business while you're like not doing super successfully on the school front, which is kind of ironic, obviously. But lots of entrepreneurs, right? Steve Jobs, others
Yeah.
who've had that kind of experience.
I think there's multiple factors to it.
Mm.
Like the school was sort of like, why don't you spend less time on your business? And like it was, and that sort of gave me that extra chip where I was like, like I believe in my business. It's
So
doing,
business school is saying spend less time on your business, focus
yeah,
on school.
because I mean,
Yeah.
it was like, well, like, yeah, I make YouTube videos, and that's kind of what I was saying. And
Mm.
like, And so whenever I got called in for academic probation, because I was like probably like a C+ student, like it
Yeah.
was barely within like the line of them saying like, well, you're gonna have to leave the program if you don't
Right.
like get it,
Mm.
like, and I was like, that'd probably be a good thing.
Mhm.
Um, like when you go into the
Yeah.
meetings, they have a perspective on it that's a little bit different. Like
Mhm.
they want you to stick to their program. They think that's the best path to success. And
Yeah.
at that point, I already knew what I was doing, and
Yeah.
so I wasn't
Yeah.
thrilled to hear that,
Yeah.
and that was definitely a factor in wanting to leave.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's different for everyone. I got a lot of value out of going through business school, and it sounds like you did as well, even though not
Hmm.
finishing it.
My
But
two most important
yeah,
hires came from the program actually, and they
awesome!
finished the program,
Wow, well,
and
that's
so
great.
that
So
alone is. And Trevor's been working with me for 5 years now,
yeah,
and he's the operational hire, and
awesome.
so it just and so like absolutely it was the best. It was a great decision to
Yeah,
go,
oh, that's great. Yeah,
but
I
not at the time. I
yeah,
didn't enjoy it.
I'm kind of curious because I had a moment like this too. You you you've been feeling this thing. You've got the chip on your shoulder. You're like, I'm going to go full time. You finally make what must be a really difficult decision. I'm sure a tough conversation with parents potentially, probably helped by the 250K in earnings at that point. You go home and then spend 2 weeks on the couch. Do you think there's like and then what got you off the couch at the end of the 2 weeks?
I think there was something to prove. Like my
Yeah.
parents at the end, when they finally like agreed to letting me leave, they were sort of like, like so like I did feel like I had something to prove to them for sure.
Yeah.
And I knew what I was capable of, and I knew where the business was at already,
Yeah.
that it can only grow from here. But I think like with a bit of time, it's like, okay, well now like it's in place, it's ready to go. I've gotten what I wanted out of this. So time to, make a plan.
Mm.
And I'm someone who gets distracted very easily,
Yeah.
and either I struggle to focus at all, or I'm like hyper fixated on like, okay, well, in like this 30-minute window,
Mm.
I can get the whole day of stuff done, but then the other half of the day I might look like I'm not even working. And so it was one of those things where it's like, okay, like you have that moment where you're like, okay, well, like what's next? And so
Mm.
yeah, luckily it
Huh.
put it into motion, and then started reaching out to brands being like, well, like I'm available to travel, and I can, and one thing after another, you just start to kind of see what you've been missing out on.
Right. Yeah. And it sounds like on the parent side, they were supportive somewhat on the entrepreneurial front from early on. I mean, I think you
Yeah.
mentioned selling stuff on Craigslist for them with a
Mhm.
commission. That seems like there's kind of a parent support there, even if it's unintentional, of inspiring that entrepreneurship in you.
For sure. Yeah. I think it took a bit of understanding
Mhm.
because my dad was a doctor, so he went to school too. He was like 35.
Yeah.
And so it
Mine
was
as well.
definitely yeah, it was a bit of an odd thing when your
Yeah.
kid wants to drop out at 20.
Yeah.
But I was like 100% like, this is what makes sense. I'm not even like split on the decision or anything. I was like, I think this is absolutely what I should do.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like coming forward to today, quite successful. Where do you go for business advice? Are there others you connect with, like peers? What do you look to when you're looking to learn and grow from here?
That's the thing that's a bit tough. I think there's just like the whole like evolution
Mhm.
and kind of change in where you prioritize your
Mhm.
time and focus. Learning is also something that in some periods you're learning a lot, and in
Mhm.
some periods I feel like I'm not learning at all. And I felt like there was a phase when I was like 15 to 20
Mhm.
where I learned all these editing skills, Photoshop and software skills, and I kind of joke about it like as someone who's been in the creator industry, I feel like I learned all of my editing skills from like at the age of 16, and
Mhm.
after that I hadn't really learned anything in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of business people are actually like that. Like in the
Mhm.
beginning, they do everything themselves. They know every little bit of it.
Yeah.
And in 10 years, when the company's like extremely
Mhm.
successful and profitable and all that, they're like, well, I don't know how to build a website anymore. Like it's
Yeah.
been a while.
Yeah.
Because you're focused on structuring the business and operating the business as
Mhm.
opposed to doing that. And I was like,
Mhm.
geez, like back then I would do my own thumbnails and all that. And
Mhm.
nowadays I'm like outsourcing every single thing
Mhm.
that I should know how to do, but I also shouldn't be doing it myself.
Right.
And so that's one where yeah, time allocation and trying to figure that out is always
Yeah.
a bit of a thing. And I think from a learning standpoint, I don't really read.
Yeah.
I've been advised to,
Yeah.
but I'm also like, well, I don't even have time to run the business,
Yeah.
let alone read. But there are also people that are much busier than me who are
Yeah.
reading, and it's one of those things where maybe I read this book
Mhm.
and might have spent say I spend like 8 hours on it, but it
Mhm.
ends up changing the trajectory of the business for many
Right.
years to come. There's
Yeah.
always that factor, but it's also very easy to just be like, well, we have to get through this whole queue of videos that are paying right
Yeah.
now instead of,
Yeah.
it's definitely something I need to focus on a little bit more.
Well, I mean, hey, it's working for you, so maybe you don't. But one thing that got me when I've struggled, I do read a fair amount, but when I've gone through lulls where I'm not, the play where you can sync the audiobook with the like your Kindle version,
Mhm.
and so I'll get started like on a plane or in a car, like listening to it, and then get home and I've
Mhm.
got the digital copy and it just jumps to where I left off. And then so it kind of the audio just keeps pulling me along. And then I get curious and I want to keep
Mhm.
reading because it's for me, it's like just getting into it and getting that hook of like, I gotta actually read this.
And what would you say are your favorite business books? Because I think a lot of people have like
Oh,
their top five of like, you need to read all of these, and this is like
yeah.
everything you need to know fundamentally of like what you've learned from your
It
experiences.
really depends on the topic. So if we go say,
General business, I guess.
okay, well, if we go strategy, which is part of general business, I'd say like this entry point, one of the best ones for me is What is Strategy by Joan McGreta. It's kind of it looks like a kid's picture book. You can read it in about an
Which is good.
hour. Yeah, it's got
I
it's
think I'd
got
actually prefer
cartoons. When
that.
I first got it, my at the then 3-year-old took it to daycare to show his friends. But I think it's like the best summary of what is strategy I've ever encountered. So I thought that was amazing. I love anything by Jim Collins. So I think starting with Great by Choice, which is more the like tech, fast moving focused
Hmm.
version of it is, and it's all cool stories like the first people traveling to the South Pole and like taking those learnings of getting to the South Pole and people dying and equipment failures and stuff and applying that to business was like a really cool learning. And then I think there's a bunch of good systems around operating the business. So there's like the Entrepreneur Operating System (EOS). There's we've used more the Scaling Up by Vern Harnish, which is like the Rockefeller Habits. Those are really good ones. I think.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And would you say like in like a creative industry, which I think Thinkific has
Yeah.
elements of like creative, and also would you say sales is like a fundamental skill that everyone should learn at a young age? Because I think like with YouTube, what's interesting is like I was like so I started from selling Craigslist stuff, and
Yeah.
I noticed I really like that to selling stuff on eBay and like
Right.
that like I find that sales nowadays is still one of the key factors of the business because you're pitching brands. And I know in the tech industry, there's fundraising, and there's some people who are really good at making product and they have incredible products, but they
Yeah.
can't sell. And then there's also people who have products that are sold by the salesperson. And then when you have both of that, that's when you have a really powerful business. But
Yeah.
I think like I'm like some people like content creation, some people don't. But I think what I've told people as young people, I'm like, just start by selling stuff. Like
Yeah.
learn to sell, learn to deal with like customer service, learn how to pitch, learn how to upsell, and that will kind of carry you on. And learning how to negotiate is just something that every facet of life should have. Would you say that was like a
I think
fun?
you're totally right there. The selling it's interesting. You look back at like ancient Rome, and I think they had 3 subjects in school, and one of them was public speaking, right? And it was more like logic and rhetoric and speaking in public and being able to make your point, which was sort
Hmm.
of related to selling. And now it's like it's starting to come back a little bit, but at least when I went through school, it was not at all in the curriculum,
Oh,
right? And I think it is such an important piece of it. And then you tie that, yeah, to selling, because really, like I've had sales jobs, just pure sales jobs before, and obviously I've had to sell a lot in my
hmm.
role even. I think you're always selling. If you're hiring someone, you're selling them on the
On the
company and the
company,
opportunity.
the
If you're
vision, and
working with a client, you're selling them on staying with you or starting with you. Like it's just it's in everything, right? You do. Um, I'm not at the level of like we have some just down the hall some phenomenal salespeople who really know how to at the core of their craft of like navigating a complex organization or getting to decision makers, things like this, that I don't have. And I've seen people build partnerships and stuff, but even partnerships, right? There's a huge amount of selling and just
yeah.
building a partner. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's a fundamental thing. If you can build that, it's probably useful, whether you're a software engineer, a designer, a content creator, whatever you're doing.
Public speaking is a good point too. Yeah, it's like well, like as you mentioned in the beginning, my face was never on camera, and that was back in the day in the internet where like parents were like, change your name on the internet, don't show your face, and now like everybody shows their face,
Yeah.
probably even too young, like on like
Hmm.
the platforms where anybody can just grab their phone and start
Yeah.
creating content, and there was a public speaking communications class, I think in grade 7, and I do remember the teacher telling my parents that like I was extremely terrible at it. But I would talk when we're not supposed to be like up there doing
Yeah.
presentations. I would be the one that's like running around the class, distracting everybody.
Yeah.
And so I think that teacher specifically was surprised that I ended up choosing a career path where I'm sitting
You
in
got to
front of
speak for a
the
living.
camera. And funny enough, the biggest crowd I've ever spoken to was at the Thinkific event. And I remember I was coming from New York, Toronto, straight to Vancouver, and I found out about the opportunity on the way to New York. And so I was like, well, I got 4 days to prep this. I'm landing the morning of. And so it was an opportunity that I was like, wow, like to go on first by myself and completely wing it.
Hmm.
I think, and I was like, yeah, like a script would be a little bit awkward. So
Hmm.
that was a good. You guys gave me a good learning opportunity.
Yeah.
That was a lot of fun. And a lot of people came from Victoria, of course, because Andrew's from Victoria. And
Yeah.
so there's quite a bit of people I knew. But that was a lot of fun.
Well, thanks for doing that. Appreciate it. Yeah.
I guess like what question for you is like, what was your mission in starting Thinkific? Did you come from the perspective of like a content creator, as someone who was like, well, like there's a lot of opportunities out there, or did you see like YouTube or online content as like a learning platform, or what was like your angle coming into like this space?
Yeah, for me, I was teaching and tutoring in person. And so I think for me, it came from a love initially. I mean, I stumbled into it. I saw a poster to go teach and tutor. And then I started my own thing, teaching and tutoring. And then that transitioned to like, let's build a blog, because I couldn't do enough of the one-on-one and even classroom stuff to reach enough people and even make enough money to pay my tuition, because I was going to school at the time. And so I was like, okay, we'll go online with a blog, and then I can have a free resource. I'll be like, look at that first, so I don't have to have the same conversation every time. And then that went into online course. And then that's where it really kind of started to take off.
So it came from like a traditional education perspective.
Well, I mean, traditional, not in a sense of teaching in a school really, but I was doing it like freelance teaching and tutoring for the LSAT law school admissions test. And it was just the love, honestly, like if you get into like the why, but why, for me, it's just, I love trying to help people make their dreams come true. And so initially that was through teaching. And now today it's, you've got a passion, a vision. How do I help you bring it to life, create a business around it where you get to go and impact other people who are watching you and make their dreams come true? So we get to like scale that.
So in the beginning, I guess, was it what type of people were creating? Because I know nowadays, like YouTubers and content creators are a huge piece of like what Thinkific is, because creators don't have any time, and that's like the biggest issue. There's some people have like a big audience that they want to teach all at once, which is I guess like in the core basis of like like you can spend your time on one person, or you can distribute a course to hundreds, thousands, or essentially unlimited amount of people. With creators, in our perspective, was like we just don't have any time, but we have an audience that would buy a product, and potentially you could sell add-ons of like a one-on-one conference call type of thing. But I also thought about like like a lot of content creators, especially in the tech field, could also be really good consultants for tech brands, because if they want to work with a creator, I mean, they're looking for the highest quality at the lowest price. And the way you get that is understanding how to work with creators. And so I think our course, we also positioned it as if you're a brand and you want to learn like how we talk to companies and like, what our perspective is, if you watch the course, you can kind of find, because like there are some brands that you work with where the rate's a lot higher. It's because they don't have like standard practice, whereas others, you build that relation, and over time, both parties win from that. So I think there's a lot of different angles. There's people that like a 13-year-old could buy the course and learn how to do YouTube and learn the business side before they start it. Somebody else who already has a platform can buy it, but also I think from a corporate perspective, it's a good way for them to educate themselves on like like how do we enter the space.
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned, there has been an evolution in who's doing courses, or even, I mean, we go way beyond courses now. It's into all sorts of learning products, communities. Originally, it was, as you put it, a bit more the conventional educator. So coach, trainer, author, expert, more starting from a place of expertise and trying to branch out actually from a lack of time of like, I'm doing one-on-one or public speaking or writing books. I don't have enough time to, $dollars per hour. I want to go to, mass scale reach. And then they were starting to use the social platforms as like a nice to have marketing channel. Whereas I've seen that's still happening, but there's also this shift now of more people starting like you, where you come up on the social platforms, you're building an audience, and then you're saying, okay, now how do I monetize this? Or in some cases, how do I monetize it better? Because the big reason I'm seeing the bulk of revenue within creators is still where you're at, which is a lot of ads and brand sponsors. Digital products are a smaller bulk of revenue, but the quality of the revenue is so much higher. Because if you can do, you know, $10 per thousand or $5 per thousand views from AdWords, or maybe $50. I'm curious what you do from like brand sponsorships, but let's say you're doing $50 RPM, revenue per thousand views, from the brand deals. When you go into something like a digital product, like a course, you could do $1,000 or $2,000 RPM, right? That's like my personal YouTube channel does way less views than yours, about 1 million so far, but it's done over 1 million in revenue from 1 million views, right? So it's about 1,000 RPM
For sure.
revenue per thousand views. So that's why we're seeing this shift now from the creators and content creators getting into more digital products.
Yeah, and I feel like it also gives the audience like a different perspective of it. I think a lot of times when you go to the YouTube channel, people see the surface level of like the luxury stuff, and a lot of times I film the stuff that I buy because pays it off. It attracts new opportunities, and that's just the surface level. And I think people often question like, well, where'd you get all this money from? Like, how do you buy this? You're just making YouTube videos, but then when I do like a podcast interview, for example, people are like, well, like he actually knows a little bit about business. I want to hear a little bit more about this. And so it's sort of like the online course gives them a different perspective, because a lot of times it's content that you may not want to like advertise in the middle of the channel.
Yeah.
If it's like a tech channel, you don't want to be like, well, you're watching a brand deal and this is how I got the brand deal.
Yeah.
That's a more behind the scenes thing. So putting it behind a paywall is education that is reasonably priced, but also very profitable for the creator. And I think in our case, the course costed less than $10,000 to produce because we already had 100,000 in camera equipment.
You're already so good at it.
We produced it in 1 week, and the editing took a long time, and
Yeah.
the website took a little bit longer because that's something we didn't have experience in. But the way we were able to be like, this makes a lot of sense, is because we're like, the red camera's already like sitting 5 feet away. We turn that on, get the lights on, and I'll just like talk for a whole week. And I had Savannah like make a whole list of questions and break down into courses. And over the phone, I would just blabber for like an hour of like, this is what we're going to cover in this topic. You organize my thoughts, because I am going to be like very all over the place. And from there, like creating visuals. And so, like it's something that is it's a really good passive opportunity, but also a way for creators to kind of interact with their audience from a behind the scenes perspective.
Right. What is the biggest misconception that people have about you as a entrepreneur?
I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the industry as a whole, but then obviously as like the creator as well. I think a lot of people don't know how much time has to go into it and how much work goes into it. Because I mean, on Instagram, it does kind of look like I'm always on vacation.
Yeah.
But it is like an ongoing list of like, years of videos that could be done. There's always something that has to be done. And I think when it's structured like a media company, there's an infinite amount of things that can be done. But once you reach a point where you're comfortable, you can also do absolutely nothing if you didn't want to that day.
Right.
So having that freedom is not exactly freedom. It is like a more than full-time job, and it has been for the last 10 years, because you're always somewhat responsible for something.
Yeah.
And I think the other big misconception that has kind of tapered down, especially in the past few years, thanks to like courses and podcasts, is that this is a very lucrative industry and there is a lot of opportunities out there. And I mean, the amount of opportunity really is infinite, and you have to get really creative with that, from being able to check out products for free as that being like a way to start, to earning money off brand deals, to being able to travel the world for free. It is essentially an industry where you can get paid to live for free if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But then from there, you kind of want a little bit more and more. And so, I would say like the opportunities are crazy. And especially for people who start out now, there are more opportunities than ever before, but there's also a lot more competition. And so a big misconception actually is, you're like, if you started 10 years ago, you're guaranteed success. Well, there's a few factors with that. It's like, are you going to stick to it for the first 5 years where there isn't any opportunities?
Yeah.
And are you going to stick to it for 10 years? But at the same time, back then, there wasn't that many opportunities. You were definitely trying to convince brands to send you a $20 item. Whereas nowadays, like people with a couple thousand subscribers can get a free smartphone.
Do you think the opportunity is even bigger now for someone who's, say, starting today and going to put in the 5 years to kind of get there, because the social platforms are all much bigger? It's more known, right, with brands.
Yeah.
Like they're not taking this call being like, you're who, you're on what, you want what.
Barrier to
they
entry
know what
is
it's
also a lot
about.
lower. You can take your smartphone and record, whereas like back then, like the iPod Touch like looked absolutely awful.
Right. Yeah.
So it kind of went to a point where people were investing a lot of money on cameras, and you did have a competitive edge if you had more money. But then it's actually gone down to like relatable content, and so people who are on the short form platforms using their smartphone actually have a bigger edge than using a proper camera. Personally, I'm like, I don't know, like the smartphone looks good, but I still kind of want to produce it. So I'm trying to find that equilibrium actually of UGC content on the phone as well as producing it in a way where it looks authentic, but to where like I would be motivated to creating it because I'm like, okay, it actually looks good. And it's like it's not just like something I recorded too easily.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. It's so easy to create content nowadays that you have to be more intentional with it.
Yeah.
But in terms of the amount of time you have to spend, it's a lot lower. And I'm not used to something going viral that you can film in 30 seconds, whereas like something that I
usually
spend,
to put the work in.
like something that you spend like days and days on might like completely flop.
Right. Yeah. I'm curious too, like throughout the journey, because I'm sure there's been different stages of it, and you even the psychology of it all, right? And like, is there phase? Have you gone through any of these things? We hear people talk about burnout, imposter syndrome. I mean, one thing I struggle from sometimes now, as you mentioned, like having a day on the couch where you can do nothing, is like, do you feel guilt because you have an endless to-do list? Like you can always be doing more. Like, is there elements of the psychology? And maybe you haven't experienced any of these things, but is there a psychological journey you've gone through as a creator or an entrepreneur this way?
Yeah, I think like multiple of those. I think it's always ongoing, and it's a tough one where it's sometimes a couple opportunities can be like, holy crap, like this is actually, I'm really lucky to be able to do this. But then you also get really comfortable and you're like, I can't wait till this to-do list is empty. And then as soon as it's empty, you're like, well, it's just the end of my career. You always ask yourself that question, like, am I going to get the same feeling? And I feel like it's a lot like what athletes feel.
Right.
Like you reach your peak, but then you kind of want that feeling again. And like sometimes once you've gotten what you've chased, you get a little bit comfortable. And I found that whenever I had lack of motivation, it was always right when I had everything I ever wanted, dream car, dream house, unlimited travel opportunities, that you kind of get a bit overwhelmed and burnt out by it, that you're sort of like, what got me here was always chasing the next big thing. Cause you you have to be motivated at some point by objective things, but also putting some pressure on yourself. And I found that whenever you got a little bit too comfortable, naturally I'd be like, well, this is my time to just hang out a little bit. But it's just something that you always have to check yourself on, not to get too comfortable, because like, and even now I feel lazy a lot of times because I used to like fly across the country in economy for like a 1 hour meeting that led to nothing because 100 other people were there for a meeting just to see like a TV. And nowadays it's like, no, like there's a price on that, but I'm also like, am I just too complacent and too comfortable and maybe asking for too much, and will this go away and I'll go back to having to do those? It's always questions that you ask yourself every day. And so, yeah, it's absolutely normal to feel those things, but I feel like you still have to like get up and do the work when you don't want to. That's kind of what I thought. Like some people were like, you have to take a break, but I feel like a lot of times a break can have negative impacts as well. Because
how so? When
you come back from it,
yeah,
you're like, well, now the to-do list is double.
Yeah.
And I have to like take another little period to get back in the groove of it. And so, yeah, I've never really taken a big filming break. I still think it's like a good exercise to get back into it, because then you have to, like during the pandemic, we actually ramp up our production, just because, like there may not be brand deals, but there's an opportunity here to
more viewership for sure,
to make content without any pressure.
Yeah. Well, look, hey, I really appreciate you having you on. Thanks so much for everything you shared. That was amazing.
Thanks for having me, and it was great talking.
Yeah, you too.